The case of Matthew Winkler reveals the hidden secrets of a deeply religious family. At times, the most horrific and unforeseen crimes take place within families that appear flawless on the surface. Naturally, even the most stable and prosperous social units can experience internal crises that go unnoticed by outsiders, yet slowly corrode the lives of every family member and ultimately result in tragedy. The Winkler family, living in the town of Selmer, was viewed by many as an exemplary household. The young pastor, his wife, and their 3 daughters appeared content, possessed everything necessary for a comfortable existence, were healthy and thriving, yet as the saying goes, still waters run deep. In this case, numerous questions were left unresolved because only a single version of events was ever presented. The story itself later became the focus of the book Sex and Murder: Secrets of a Pastor. On March 22, 2006, devastating news shook the small town of Selmer, Tennessee. A 31-year-old pastor named Matthew Winkler was savagely killed inside his own home, while his wife Mary and their 3 daughters, 8-year-old Patricia, 6-year-old Maria Eliza, and 1-year-old Brianna, vanished without leaving any trace. That evening, the minister of the Church of Christ failed to appear for the scheduled church service, which he was expected to attend together with his family. This absence immediately raised concern, as Matthew was known for his sense of responsibility and would never miss a planned obligation without notifying someone beforehand. Additionally, none of the family members answered their phones, which made the situation even more alarming. Worried members of the community decided to visit the Winkler residence to determine what had happened and whether assistance was needed. From the outside, the house appeared completely ordinary. The doors and windows were undamaged, and there were no visible signs of anything suspicious. Inside, lights were on in several rooms, and a television could be heard playing loudly in one of them. This created the impression that the homeowners were present and going about their normal activities. The front door was locked, but no one responded to knocking. Phone calls continued to go unanswered, and because the windows were covered with curtains, it was impossible to see what was happening inside or whether anyone was there at all. Despite the odd nature of the situation, no one immediately contacted the police. Instead, a call was placed to an elder of the religious community, who advised them to search for a spare key and enter the house themselves. Another hour and a half passed. When members of the community finally managed to get inside, they were confronted with a chilling sight. Everything inside the home was neatly in place. There were no signs of forced entry, yet the residents were nowhere to be found. Everything seemed ordinary until they entered the marital bedroom. There, on the floor, lying in a pool of his own blood, was the body of the pastor. There was a massive gunshot wound in his back. Blood had sprayed throughout the room, and dried bloody foam covered his face. By that time, the body had already become cold and rigid. It was clear that Matthew had been lying there for many hours and had most likely been killed earlier that morning, as he was still wearing his pajamas. Only after this discovery was the police finally called. By the time officers arrived, a large crowd of neighbors, church members, and curious bystanders had gathered both inside and outside the house, eager to see what was happening. Every one of these individuals left behind fingerprints at the crime scene. They also left shoe prints, wiped away or trampled potential evidence, and significantly complicated the investigation. The police transported the body for a forensic examination and determined that the pastor had been killed by a single gunshot to the back from a large-caliber firearm. He died within minutes of being wounded due to massive blood loss, without any chance to call for help. It was entirely impossible to determine with certainty whether any strangers had been present in the house at the time, because those who arrived before law enforcement had effectively destroyed all possible traces. The circumstances of the crime were extremely unusual, and the individuals who might have provided clarity had vanished. The whereabouts of the murdered man's wife and daughters remained unknown. Police considered the possibility that the woman and children had either been abducted or also killed. Additionally, the Winkler's family minivan was missing from the garage. An extensive search operation was launched, and the state issued a yellow alert. This indicated that children were missing and urged all citizens to remain alert and assist in locating them. However, to fully understand the situation, it is necessary to examine the story from the very beginning. Matthew Bryan Winkler was born on November 21, 1974, in the scenic rural town of Henderson, Tennessee. He was the youngest of 3 sons born to Dan and Diane Winkler. Matthew and his 2 older brothers, James and Daniel, were raised in a strictly conservative Christian household. Their parents were deeply religious and raised their sons with firm discipline and obedience. It is important to note that Matthew became a church minister as a 5th-generation preacher. His father, great-uncle Michael, grandfather Wendell, great-grandfather Merlin Winkler, and great-great-grandfather Merlin Paul Winkler Sr. had all served as gospel preachers at various points in time. To further emphasize this legacy, his father also operated a local preacher's school and was a well-respected and influential figure in his hometown. During their childhood, the Winkler brothers regularly attended Sunday school and actively participated in church-related activities. In addition, during his high school years, Matthew showed a deep passion for soccer, and everyone who watched him play on the field remarked that he possessed real ability and could potentially grow into an exceptional athlete known worldwide. However, later on, the young man chose to give up a highly promising sports career in order to devote himself to Bible study and church service. Since the preaching work of the head of the household involved constant travel, his wife and children almost always accompanied him. As a result, Matthew attended several different schools during his childhood, but the energetic, outgoing, and friendly boy quickly made friends and earned respect wherever he went. When he completed his schooling, his family was living in a small town called Austin, located in the state of Texas. Matthew was a creative individual and possessed strong charisma, but he could not boast of any particularly remarkable academic achievements. After finishing high school, he enrolled in Freed-Hardeman College and successfully graduated from it. At the same time, the young man began to try himself as a pastor under the close supervision of his father. Matthew served as the youth minister at the Central Church of Christ in the city of McMinnville. Later, he was appointed to a preaching position at the 4th Street Church of Christ in Selmer, Tennessee. Mary Carol Winkler, whose maiden name was Freeman, was born in December 1973 in Geist Township, Tennessee, and was the elder of 2 daughters in her family. She was also raised in a deeply religious household with strict rules. For many years, the head of the family served as a pastor in the Christian church where the girl attended Sunday school. A few years later, a second daughter was born to the family and was named Patricia. Unfortunately, the child was born prematurely and suffered from a number of serious medical conditions, including cerebral palsy, encephalitis, epilepsy, and mental retardation. For many years, the parents refused to accept the discouraging diagnoses of their daughter and desperately attempted to treat her, even agreeing to experimental therapies. However, these efforts did not lead to any significant improvement. Mary deeply loved her younger sister, always treated her with tenderness, and cared for her as best she could. But in 1987, when 10-year-old Patricia was bathing in the tub, her older sister stepped away for just a minute to get something from the bathing supplies. At that exact moment, the girl experienced another epileptic seizure. When Mary returned to the room, her sister was no longer breathing, and all attempts to revive her were unsuccessful. For a 13-year-old girl, it was an enormous shock and the first loss she had ever experienced in her life. She blamed herself for the tragedy and was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Teachers who noticed Mary's terrible condition sent her to a school psychologist, and working with this specialist helped her. But her father, upon learning what was happening, caused a scandal and forbade his daughter from attending these sessions, stating that such issues should only be discussed within the family. In reality, the girl never received genuine emotional support from her parents. Mary grew up modest and very shy. She tried to avoid any conflicts, and after the tragic death of her younger sister, she became withdrawn. Since her father did not allow her to seek help from a professional, the trauma over the years developed into serious psychological problems. After Patricia's death, the parents decided to adopt a young girl named Charlotte, who came from a dysfunctional large family. Soon, the couple was also permitted to take custody of Charlotte's 2 brothers and sister, allowing the family to be reunited in their new home. Mary once again became the older sister and took care of the younger children while helping her mother. The future spouses met shortly after Matthew graduated from high school. The young man was noticeable, attractive, athletic, and enjoyed great popularity with the opposite sex, but a strict religious upbringing did not allow him to engage freely in romantic affairs. The young people immediately took a liking to one another, which quickly developed into love. For both of them, it was the first strong feeling they had experienced in their lives, and after just a couple of months, they met each other's parents and, having received their blessing, began planning a wedding. In April 1994, the lovers were married. When the family welcomed their eldest daughter, Patricia, the head of the household was still attending college and was forced to interrupt his studies for a time. He took a job at a construction site, but did not stay there long because he was unaccustomed to heavy physical labor. During this period, for the first time, Mary became aware of Matthew's difficult character. He was often angry with others, easily irritated by minor things, and at times was unable to control his temper. But Mary tried not to complain and did not tell anyone about what was happening within her family. A gentle young woman raised in the spirit of patriarchy obeyed her husband in everything. At first, the Winklers lived close to Mary's parents' home, allowing her to see them regularly. But soon Mrs. Freeman was diagnosed with cancer, which progressed rapidly, and within just a few months she literally wasted away from the illness. This became another shock for Mary, and the responsibility of caring for her underage siblings fell on her shoulders. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Mary was pregnant again at the time. However, shortly after the birth of their second daughter, the family moved to another city, where they purchased a small house of their own. After the relocation, Mary became entirely consumed with caring for the infant and almost completely stopped communicating with her father, as well as with her younger brothers and sisters, who were overly demanding and constantly required attention. In addition, the young mother began to experience severe postpartum depression. Everyone who was closely familiar with the Winkler family noticed certain peculiarities in Mary's character and behavior. The young woman was described as an introvert and even as sociophobic. She did not interact with anyone. It was difficult for her to form new acquaintances, let alone close friendships. She suffered from sudden mood changes, was inclined toward melancholy, and even the smallest thing could reduce her to tears. While Matthew was building his career as a pastor, his wife became more and more withdrawn. The situation grew even more complicated when Mary became pregnant once again, and several months later she learned that the fetus had died inside her womb. This news deeply shook Mary, who had been eagerly anticipating the arrival of this child and strongly dreamed of having a large, close-knit family. To see the long-awaited 2 lines on a pregnancy test again, she had to wait another 2 years, and her happiness knew no bounds. This time, she concealed her pregnancy for a long period, as if she were afraid of something. She did this until her condition became impossible to hide. Once again, people began talking about Mary's strange behavior and pathological silence. The unusual behavior of Mrs. Winkler was linked not only to the severe psychological trauma she had suffered in childhood, but also to the very unhealthy atmosphere within her own family, which further destabilized her already fragile nervous system. The head of the household was an authoritarian man who demanded absolute obedience. Despite the fact that in public the Winklers appeared to be an ideal married couple, with trust, mutual respect, and harmony, in reality their neighbors repeatedly heard the husband yelling at and snapping at his wife for no apparent reason. No one could even imagine that a respected pastor might raise his hand against his wife until one day Mary appeared with a large black eye. Although she denied domestic violence and claimed it had been an accident, rumors quickly spread throughout the city about the cruelty of the young preacher who beat the mother of his children. In addition, at some point Matthew developed an uncontrollable desire to experiment in the bedroom. He suggested that his wife diversify their intimate life with role-playing games, adult toys, and similar practices, but for Mary, who had been raised strictly and held conservative views, this was unacceptable. She strongly limited her husband in this regard, which infuriated him, and he repeatedly attempted to get what he wanted by force. One day, after another instance of abuse in bed, Mary tearfully called her only close friend and complained about the situation. The friend, who had promised to keep her secret, immediately spread the information, which provoked a new wave of rumors and gossip about the unacceptable behavior of a clergyman. At that time, Matthew was being considered for a promotion and aspired to become a local church leader, but he was rejected due to the rapidly spreading unpleasant rumors about him. Moreover, he was also removed from his position in Sunday school, where he had been teaching God's word to children and was held in good standing. This decision was made at the request of parents who had also heard about the pastor's strange inclinations. All of this forced the family to leave their place of residence and move to another city, where they planned to start anew. They settled in Selmer, where they quickly earned the love and respect of those around them. Matthew once again took a position as a church pastor, and his wife found a part-time job to make a small contribution to the family's income. And although life within the family was still far from smooth, their neighbors, as well as the congregation of the church where Matthew preached, regarded Mary and Matthew as an ideal couple and their family as exemplary. Living next door to the Winklers was a young married couple with whom they quickly became friends. They often visited one another, celebrated holidays together, and shared news and secrets. A few months before the tragedy, during a joint dinner at the pastor's home, Mary boasted to the neighbors that her husband had bought her a gun for self-defense and had already taken her to the shooting range several times to teach her how to handle it confidently. Mary proved to be a rather capable student, quickly mastering all the nuances and accurately hitting the targets. Moreover, it turned out that the Winklers already had firearms in the house, which the pastor had purchased earlier, also for self-defense. The guests wondered why the pastor and his wife needed all of this, since they lived in a quiet town where they had no enemies and were loved and respected by everyone around them. After yet another move by the couple, their financial situation left much to be desired. Mary searched for various part-time jobs and also decided to pursue a medical education in order to later work in a clinic and help sick children. Soon, Mary decided to improve the family's financial condition through financial fraud. She later claimed that she did not realize she was doing anything illegal and intended to repay all the money as soon as she managed to stabilize their situation. What Mary was doing is commonly known as artificially inflating account balances. Mrs. Winkler also received checks from unspecified sources and then deposited them into a bank account she shared with her husband. She then changed the account's mailing address so that all correspondence would be directed there. The total sum of the checks she received amounted to almost $17,000, which raised certain suspicions among bank employees, who decided to summon the couple to the branch office in order to clarify the circumstances and resolve the situation. However, the pastor and his wife never appeared at the bank, which only heightened the suspicions. It was assumed that Matthew was completely unaware of what his wife had been doing. Nevertheless, after Matthew's death, his wife attempted to prove in court that the entire fraud scheme had been his idea and that it was he who forced her to carry out the questionable transactions, while he himself stayed in the background without attracting attention. Where did Mary disappear to? When Mr. Winkler was discovered murdered in his own home, his wife and daughters were placed on the wanted list, as there were fears that they too might be in mortal danger. At first, the quiet, timid, and home-oriented Mary was viewed exclusively as a possible victim of the crime. However, after conversations with neighbors and the receipt of information from the bank regarding financial fraud, she became the main suspect in the murder of her own husband. It was urgently necessary to determine where Mary had disappeared, where the children were, and whether they were safe. They, along with the family car, were placed on the wanted list. Attempts were also made to track transactions made with Mary's bank card and to determine her location using her mobile phone signal. Mary was found just one day later in a resort town in Alabama, where she and her children were enjoying themselves at a local amusement park. It was as if the mother wanted to give her children one last celebration, realizing that she would soon be going to prison and would not see her girls for a long time. When the family was brought to the police station for questioning, the two older daughters confidently told the same story. According to them, intruders had broken into the house and injured their father, and their mother picked up a gun to protect them. They were then forced to flee for their lives. As the girls said, their father was alive and in the hospital, and they would soon go to see him and then return home. What exactly happened inside the house? As it later became clear, Patricia and Maria Eliza did not witness and learned about the events only from their mother's words. They heard only a gunshot and briefly saw their father lying on the floor, after which their mother put them into the car and they drove away. Mary almost immediately began to confess, but she claimed that she could not reconstruct the entire sequence of events of that day, referring to a temporary blackout. According to her, her husband had abused her for years, humiliating her and forcing her into forms of intimacy that were unacceptable to her. Mary insisted that it was he who had initiated the financial fraud she carried out. Matthew demanded total obedience, lost his temper easily, and once even used his fists. This was confirmed by Matthew's secretary at his previous place of work. The woman repeatedly witnessed how the pastor insulted his wife, who carefully brought him lunch to the church, yet he was always dissatisfied with something. On the evening before the tragedy, another scandal broke out in the family, as a result of which the spouses went to sleep in separate rooms. Mary cried all night, and in the morning she did not realize how a shotgun, which her husband kept loaded, ended up in her hands. She entered Matthew's room and shot him in the back while he was still lying in bed. Matthew collapsed onto the floor, with bloody foam coming from his mouth and nose. According to Mary, while still alive, her husband whispered, "Why?" To which she replied, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Mary then took her daughters and left the house, and her husband, as experts later established, tried to reach for the phone to call for help but no longer had the strength to do so. Incidentally, the murder weapon was found in the trunk of the car in which Mary left with the children. For what purpose she took it with her, Mrs. Winkler was also unable to explain. At the trial, the role-playing costumes found in their home were presented as evidence of the pastor's humiliation and moral abuse of his wife. Upon seeing them, Mary turned pale and then became hysterical. Despite the fact that she confused her testimony and gave several different versions of what had happened, the court agreed that she was the victim of a domestic tyrant and that the killing was the result of years of anger, resentment, and pain. However, this did not relieve Mary of responsibility for her actions. In April 2007, the court delivered its final verdict in this complex and confusing case. Mrs. Winkler was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, but her mental state raised many questions. Initially, it was expected that the young woman would be sentenced to at least 6 years in prison. In the end, however, she received a sentence of less than 1 year. She spent 2 months of that term in a psychiatric hospital, where specialists attempted to determine whether she could regain custody of her children after her release. In the summer of 2008, Mary was granted sole custody of her daughters, who had lived with their paternal grandparents during that entire time. Matthew's parents were extremely distressed by this outcome. They believed that their daughter-in-law had deliberately killed their son and had received virtually no punishment, and now their granddaughters were placed entirely in her care. However, all of their numerous attempts to file appeals were unsuccessful. As for the fraud case, it never reached the courtroom. The bank never filed formal charges, and the entire matter was dropped. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We post crime case videos every night. Until next time, stay sharp, stay vigilant.